On an April morning in 1923, light cut through the fine dust on East 2nd Street and drew pale bands across the pine counter of an empty room, on a block where the traffic of wagons, light trucks, and people on foot kicked up dust when it hadn't rained and turned into sticky mud when the water came. The building stood near the Frisco line, where rail cars creaked and couplers clanged, and the sound of switching and whistles mixed with the noise of shops and depots. It was an area where coal, oil, and grease were common smells, and where soot settled into the cracks of window frames. Outside, Tulsa smelled of oil and dry earth, and the wind carried fragments of conversation from men in crushed hats and jackets already shining with wear, people drawn by oil money and the services growing up around it. Inside, even before there was a sign on the door, there was already an accounting of risks. If someone noticed who went to work in that room, who would sign the receipts, who would come in through the front, and who would have to wait in the alley, the business could die before it was born. It wasn't only about losing customers. In Tulsa, still with Greenwood marked by the fire of 1921 and the city living under segregation rules practiced at the counter, on the streetcar, and on the sidewalk, certain kinds of closeness drew the attention of people who didn't write letters, only left signs. It was worth following to the end to see how two ordinary women tried to build a routine where the city insisted on imposing fear, and how every small choice carried a price that never appeared on an invoice. Etta Mae Caldwell, white, 32 years old, had steady hands and short nails, the hands of someone used to scrubbing stamp ink and cutting paper, and also to handling boxes, invoices, and the fine dust that gathers on stationery shelves. She had grown up in Sepulpa, but since 1919, she had worked in Tulsa as a clerk in a downtown stationery shop, near South Main and 4th, in an area of display windows and offices where the flow depended on commerce and the money circulating with leases and services. She knew the sound of a cash register the way someone knows the time of their own supper, and she knew the weight of coins and crumpled bills at the end of the day. When her boss warned early in the year that the rent would go up and business was weak, Etta heard what wasn't said. There was always another younger girl, cheaper, and always someone's nephew, and turnover at the counter was part of the normal workings of small stores. She rented a room on West 6th Street, near the river, in a rooming house where you paid by the week or by the month, and where comfort was the bare minimum. And she carried in her pocket a blue-covered notebook where she wrote down ream prices, paper weights, types of paper for receipts, and the cost of having printing done in Kansas City. Because many stationery and print shops still depended on orders by train and on lead times that varied with freight and availability. That April, she was there because she had saved a little and because she had found someone who knew how to add and keep numbers with the same precision she used to cut paper. Lillie Johnson, black, 28 years old, was a bookkeeper at a small insurance company that served families in Greenwood and on the north side, at a time when funeral, life, and property insurance were an important part of the attempt at stability for people who had little and needed to record what they could. She had handwriting that looked drawn with a ruler and a patience that held even when someone on the street called her girl with a short laugh, and that patience was also a way of not offering a reaction that could be used against her. She lived with her mother on North Hartford Avenue, in a house repaired with salvage boards after 1921, with demolition lumber, reused nails, and visible patches, because rebuilding in Greenwood moved forward amid lack of credit, expensive materials, and the need to remake quickly what had been lost. Since the destruction, Lillie's mother kept nails in a cookie tin, as if each nail were a promise that nothing would fall again, and as if the habit of saving were a practical answer to scarcity. Lillie crossed to downtown by streetcar when she could, or on foot when she needed to save, knowing the streetcar had seating and conduct rules imposed in practice, and that crossing certain blocks could weigh more than the distance itself. At every corner, the city reminded her There were places where her presence was tolerated and places where it was suspect. In the empty room, the idea was simple and dangerous. A small print shop for forms, receipts, promotional posters, letterhead for butcher shops, barber shops, pharmacies, garages. Ordinary things, necessary, repeated, that merchants always needed, because commerce depended on paper for control, billing, and advertising, and because not everyone had the time or money to wait for an order from elsewhere. The equipment would be used, bought from a printer who had closed on Archer Street, in a setting where small businesses opened and shut easily, depending on rent, credit, and clientele. A hand-operated paper cutter, a small foot treadle press, a few cases of type, a set of numbering machines, a composing table, iron and wood pieces that demanded constant maintenance, cleaning of dried ink, and pressure adjustments to avoid smearing. Etta had contacts with paper suppliers. Lillie knew how to set prices, control intake, negotiate terms with customers, and not get lost in empty promises. And she also knew that a badly given deadline became debt, and debt became conflict. The plan required that, at least for a time, the face at the counter would be Etta's. The name on the invoices would be Etta's. The hand doing the accounts in the back would be Lillie's. It wasn't a romantic secret. It was survival engineering in a place where a rumor was enough to erase a doorway. Etta set her handbag on the counter and examined the plank floor, where there were still marks from old furniture and drag scratches, and where the wood, dried out in places, showed years of use without fresh varnish. Lillie came in through the back door, which opened onto a narrow corridor that smelled of wet coal, a smell that came from depots and from stoves and boilers in nearby buildings, and also from standing water in gutters and corners. She carried a box of ledgers and a cloth bundle with pencils and a metal ruler, work tools as necessary as the press. They greeted each other with economical gestures, like people meeting at a station who know any delay becomes an invitation to eyes. They set practical rules without ceremony. The front door would only be treated as an entrance once there was a sign and foot traffic. The cash book would stay away from the window. Anything sensitive would not cross the street in the wrong hands. That day, they started with the basics, because the basics are where a business holds up or collapses. They measured the distance between the wall and where the press would sit, thinking about space for the treadle, the composing table, and moving around without bumping loose type. They counted outlets, knowing not every old building had reliable wiring and that weak bulbs and exposed wires were common in cheap rooms. They tested the faucet at the small wash basin, which spat rusty water, a sign of old pipes and water left standing, and the stained basin showed prior use. Etta noted the size of the display window, imagining posters with big letters advertising low prices and fast service, the kind seen in downtown shops. Lillie opened the book and drew columns. Paper, ink, rent, maintenance, delivery, wages. With each column, she remembered that numbers were also protection. A mistake could become a reason for someone to call the police or for a customer to say they'd been cheated, and accusations in Tulsa sometimes grew legs too easily. Tulsa was a city in a hurry. Oil pulled people from Texas, Kansas, Arkansas, and the circulation of workers, brokers, mechanics, and merchants made downtown seem always in motion. The streets downtown had shops with bright windows and men talking about stocks and leases, and the local newspapers fed the climate of opportunity. But there was also the other map, the one that didn't come in a brochure, the map of where a black person could eat, buy, sit, wait, and where they should leave before tolerance turned to hostility. There were signs, there were looks, there was memory. Greenwood rebuilt with brick and stubbornness, but carried constant surveillance and reconstruction, done with new and reused material. Lived alongside the reminder that what had been razed could be attacked again. When a truck stopped too long, when a group of white men stood on a corner for no reason, Someone in Greenwood noticed and passed the information along like a fire warning. Etta had heard stories of what happened in 1921, like anyone in Tulsa. She hadn't been in Greenwood that night, but she remembered seeing smoke on the horizon and hearing, the next morning, people speaking low in a market, and how certain conversations changed the subject when someone approached. She remembered the way certain men said the word order as if it were an object that could be gripped tightly, and how the word served to justify what wasn't written into minutes. Etta wasn't looking for confrontation. She wanted to pay rent. She wanted to avoid going back to Sepulpa with her head down. Even so, when she met Lillie at the end of 1922 in a pay line at the bank near Boston Avenue, she felt something more practical than courage. The sense that this woman knew how to hold a structure up. She saw Lillie's hands holding papers carefully, the quick glance at numbers, the way she didn't waste words. She thought about how the stationery shop where she worked kept losing money for lack of control. She thought about how merchants complained about delays for forms coming from far away. She thought about what a small print shop could be, with quick turnaround and fair prices. And then she thought about the impossible, doing it with someone the city insisted on pushing to the back of doors. The moral shove, without that name, without a speech, came on a stifling Thursday in early May, a sky holding rain without the nerve to let it go, with the heavy air that precedes a storm and makes clothes stick to skin. Etta was in the stationery shop when a man came in with a thin mustache, a light suit, cigar smell, and the posture of someone used to being served without delay. He asked for a pad of numbered receipts and remarked, as if remarking on the weather, that people from the north had been trying to mix business. The boss reacted with a laugh that sought complicity and hurried to reaffirm that certain things should remain as they always had, as if it were a natural rule and not a choice. The man left coins on the counter and, before he went out, noticed Etta's notebook and probed her about plans. The question came soft, but stayed in her like a finger pressed to a pulse, measuring a beat. That same week, Lillie returned home on North Hartford and found her mother holding a crumpled envelope. There was no stamp, only a newspaper clipping inside, talking about safety and good manners, advice language that, in that context, functioned as a warning. At the bottom, a pencil-written sentence said business didn't go with certain company. There was no signature. There didn't need to be. Her mother didn't cry, but she put the envelope in the cookie tin with the nails, as if it were one more object to be used in a future repair, and as if saving were the only possible response without drawing attention. On Saturday, they met early in the East Second Room. The heat already made the wood smell stronger, and the still air carried dust and a residue of old ink embedded in corners. Etta brought coffee in a thermos and 2 paper cups, an ordinary thing from counters and hurried work. Lillie brought the unstamped envelope and set it on the table, smoothing the paper with her palm. Faced with the veiled threat, decisions came without performance, because time spent hesitating was also time spent becoming a target. A formal partnership with registered papers and a double name could become an immediate target because registration and a sign are also a trail. A full retreat would mean accepting, without resistance, that the city would keep deciding where each of them could earn a living. There, between the smell of old ink and dust, they made a choice that didn't feel like a choice, but was. It would not be a formal partnership. There would be no papers saying partners. There would be a private agreement, handwritten by Lillie, kept in 2 copies, one in each house, as if paper could be proof and also risk. The name on the door would be Caldwell Commercial Printing. Lillie would be described as a consultant when it was necessary to say something, a word that fit into conversation without raising immediate suspicion. Etta would be the face. It was unjust, and both of them knew it. but it was a way to keep the door open long enough for money to start coming in and for routine to become a kind of shelter, even if narrow. The work truly began the following week. A truck brought the press and the cutter, and the unloading, done with effort and improvised levers, left marks on the floorboards and a trail of grease in the corners. The men who unloaded made jokes about old machines, spat on the floor, took their pay, and left without looking toward the back corridor, as if the back didn't exist. Etta cleaned the press with kerosene, her hands turning rough, and the sharp solvent smell filled the room for hours. Lillie organized the typing cases, separating worn letters, checking sizes, and lining up what still served, because mixed type becomes error, and error becomes waste. The sound of metal striking metal filled the room. With the front door still without a sign, they worked with the curtain drawn, turning the display window into opaque glass. A few days later, they printed the first batch, receipt books for a shoe repair shop on South Peoria. Etta delivered them personally, with a controlled smile and a clean apron, and took payment in crumpled bills, folded and tucked in her pocket as if fragile. The owner, a white man with large hands and the smell of leather, approved the heavier paper and the well-aligned numbering, details that meant seriousness to him. The promise of return was the first real brick of the business. Simple posters came next for a pharmacy on 11th Street announcing a soap promotion, black letters on yellow paper, ink that had to dry without smearing, and paper that couldn't ripple with humidity. Etta taped one in the window and heard a woman comment that it was good to have something made right there, because ordering from outside cost time and freight. Meanwhile, Lillie kept the cash book the way someone keeps a candle lit in a windy place. Every cent recorded, every expense logged, with date and reason, because office discipline was also a defense against accusation. When Etta arrived with money, Lillie counted it twice, separating change and noting what was payment and what was a deposit. When a customer asked for terms, Lillie calculated the risk, remembering that terms without guarantee become a deadbeat account, and that a deadbeat account, for someone without protection, could become desperation. Etta began to understand that calm wasn't submission. It was discipline, a way of not offering openings. But Tulsa offered its own openings for danger. At the end of May, a man appeared at the print shop door and stood looking at the empty window too long, as if measuring the place and its movement. He wore a white shirt and suspenders and had a thick ring on his finger, and the kind of presence that didn't need to raise its voice to be noticed. He asked for letterhead for a neighborhood association and, while Etta showed samples, asked who did the books, as if the question were part of the order. Etta answered in a generic way, without giving names, keeping the tone of ordinary service. The man left without buying, and the short smile he left behind didn't match an ordinary refusal. The next day, the back door lock was scratched, as if someone had tested a blade there, and the metal bore a fresh, bright mark. Lillie ran her finger over the mark, and then washed her hand afterward, slowly, as if the mark carried dirt that wouldn't come off. On a Saturday in early June, a quick rain fell late in the afternoon, drumming on the tin roof and leaving the air cooler for an hour, and water ran through the gutter with a tinny sound. Etta stayed at the shop later, finishing a batch of posters for a grocery near Denver Avenue, cheap paper that required care not to tear in the cutter. Lillie had already left before dark, as they agreed, so as not to draw attention with comings and goings at the wrong hours, because downtown changed mood when the light fell. Etta turned off the lights, checked the cutter, covered the press with a tarp. As she locked up, she heard footsteps on the sidewalk, but saw no one when she looked through the window, only the wet street and the weak reflection of a street lamp. Early Sunday, Etta returned to pick up an order that had to be delivered Monday. The street was quiet, only a thin dog crossing, and the silence was the kind that makes any sound feel like a warning. When she opened the door, she smelled it first, kerosene. Then she saw the stained floor, the tarp thrown aside, the composing table overturned. The press was there, but the type was scattered like teeth, mixed with dust and dried ink. In the back, near the wash basin, there was a dark puddle and a burn match. Someone had tried to light it and failed, or had given up, and the attempt made the method clear. Quick fire, no witnesses. On the wall, written in charcoal, a short crooked sentence warned her to be careful about company. Etta didn't scream. She closed the door slowly and rested her forehead against the wood for a second, as if her body needed a fixed point. Then she walked to the phone booth on the corner and called Lillie, choosing words that wouldn't draw attention from other ears, but making it clear it was urgent, because a public phone wasn't a place for explanation. When Lillie arrived through the back door half an hour later, her mother came with her, insisting on not staying home. The two black women entered with alert eyes, as if the room had turned into an open street. Lillie saw the sentence on the wall and didn't touch it. Her mother looked at the kerosene puddle and tightened something in her pocket, a small gesture that seemed to be searching for a nail. They assessed what had happened without theatrics. They considered calling the police and dismissed it, because the police in Tulsa rarely turned threats against black people into real protection, and an official visit could become a pretext for too many questions, too much record, and for turning the target into a talked-about case. The decision was to clean, repaint, reinforce the door, and above all to open with a sign and routine, as if normalcy could serve as a shield. It was the first irreversible event. The attempted fire didn't consume the building, but it changed the air. From then on, it was no longer only a difficult business. It was a watch business. Etta wiped away the charcoal with a wet cloth and soap, but the grime left a shadow on the peeling paint. Even after they repainted, the wall seemed to keep the mark underneath, as if plaster had memory. The following week, they worked with contained urgency. They needed to open officially before fear became quitting and before hesitation itself became an invitation. They hung the sign, Caldwell Commercial Printing. Simple letters, white background, paint that drew no attention for luxury, only for existence. Etta arranged the window with samples of receipts and posters. Lillie began arriving earlier, before the rush, and leaving before late afternoon. When she needed to stay, she remained in the back, with the door ajar, listening to footsteps on the sidewalk and the sound of streetcars and trucks as if they were a clock. Lillie's mother began bringing lunch wrapped in cloth and sat for an hour in a chair near the corridor, as if the presence of an older woman might discourage an impulse, and as if her body there were one more lock. Customers came, slowly, and each order felt like routine and a test at once. A butcher on West first ordered labels, paper that had to withstand handling and grease. A small hotel near Union Depot ordered letterhead, reception, and billing paper. A black church pastor in Greenwood ordered service programs for a Sunday in June, and that order was delivered by a boy on a bicycle, so no one would see Lillie crossing with packages. The boy, Clarence, was 12 and had the heedless courage of a child. He liked the smell of ink and the sound of the cutter. Etta paid him 50 cents per delivery and gave him misprinted scraps to make paper airplanes, leftovers that in a small print shop couldn't be wasted. Near the end of June, the heat returned heavy, and the city felt sticky with flies and dust clinging to glass and wood. An important customer appeared, the manager of a hardware store on South Boston Avenue. He wanted 1,000 order forms, with numbering and a space for signature. It was enough money to pay 2 months' rent, and also to buy ink and paper without depending on credit. The manager came in with his hat in his hand and looked everything over closely, as if searching for dust to justify distrust, and as if judging whether the place was respectable by the wrong signs. Etta served him, showed samples, talked about turnaround. The manager probed whether there was anyone else in the business. Etta kept her answer limited to service and schedule. The manager stepped toward the back, as if he wanted to see beyond the counter. Lillie was behind the door, holding her pencil, motionless. That day, Lillie's mother wasn't there and Clarence wasn't either. There was only silence and the distant sound of a streetcar. The manager left with the order signed, but with a lingering look at the back door. That afternoon, Etta and Lillie printed late because the order was large and required care, and because an error on 1,000 sheets becomes a loss you can't recover. The treadle press demanded rhythm, and fatigue made the leg ache. The smell of black ink soaked into clothing. Lillie numbered with the stamp, page after page, counting under her breath, as if the numbers were steps. On a Sunday night, when the city was quieter, the consequence came with cruel clarity. Clarence rode by the shop to drop off a message from a Greenwood customer. He saw a pickup truck parked farther down, lights off. He saw two men leaning against a pole. He had learned early not to look too much. Even so, on that street, a black child with a bicycle drew attention. He tried to pass quickly. One of the men crossed and grabbed the handlebars. The bicycle fell. Clarence hit his knee on the ground. The other man came closer, and what happened there was understood the next day by the signs. The boy got home limping, his face swollen, a rib sore, and his body carrying the instruction without words. On Monday, Clarence didn't show up. Late in the afternoon, Lillie went to Greenwood, to the boy's aunt's house on North Greenwood Avenue, and found Clarence lying on a sofa, a wet cloth on his forehead, in a room where care was improvised with whatever was at hand. The aunt spoke low, as if the house had walls too thin, and as if any detail could cross the street. It was decided there, in gestures and silence, that he would not cross to downtown anymore. The rule didn't come as advice. It came as necessity. Lillie returned to the shop with a heavier silence. Etta saw it in the way Lillie's hands trembled as she aligned a stack of paper. The attack on the boy was irreversible because it took away their simplest bridge between the two sides of the city, and because it put flesh and pain into the business's accounting. It was no longer only kerosene on the floor. It was a child's body marked. Days later, they delivered the hardware order. Etta carried the boxes tied with twine, set them on the store counter, and received a check, paper that required a bank and endorsement, and that, for her, was also the risk of delay. The manager counted the boxes without smiling. When Etta left, she saw two men standing across the street, watching. They did nothing, but their gaze was like the sentence on the wall, only alive. That week, Lillie wrote new rules in Etta's blue-covered notebook in small letters. Deliveries only by day, alternate routes, no paper with Lillie's name on the street, no messages left at a door, money kept in two places. Etta read and put the notebook away without arguing. The partnership, which had begun as a work arrangement, now carried the weight of an agreement made inside tight limits, with the body of the city pushing from outside. It didn't need to be said out loud what each of them carried. It was enough to comply. July came with heat that felt almost solid. On the 4th, fireworks burst downtown, white children ran with little flags, and the noise spread through the blocks as if it were proof of normalcy. In Greenwood, there were smaller celebrations with food in yards and low music because caution was part of the way of existing. The print shop worked anyway because merchants wanted post-holiday sale posters. Etta wore her apron, hair pinned up, eyes burning with fatigue. Lillie did the books with a paper fan beside her, fanning her own face between one column and the next, and the fan was made of the same material that held the business up. In mid-month, a letter arrived at Etta's post office box at the 2nd Street Post Office. Thick paper, no return address. Inside, a typed sentence stated that a good business depended on reputation. Nothing more. Etta took the letter to the shop and put it in the back of a drawer, but she couldn't forget the weight of the paper. Reputation in Tulsa could be a weapon. A rumor about mixing was enough, and half the downtown customers would vanish. One wrong word, and the building could turn to ash. Etta acquired the habit of looking twice at the street before turning off the lights. In August, a practical change came. Lillie began meeting black customers in Greenwood under a cover name, using a borrowed room in the back of a barbershop on Greenwood Avenue, near Easton, a place where men came and went all day and where one more presence didn't draw as much attention. She carried samples in a leather folder and took orders for programs, cards, labels. Then, at night, those orders became paper on the East Second Press, printed in silence, with care not to leave visible packages on the street. It was a circuit that kept black customers from needing to enter through the front of the downtown shop and kept white customers from seeing a black bookkeeper behind the counter. It was degrading, but it allowed money to come in from both sides. It also gave Lillie a space where she could keep her body less tense, without measuring every step in the corridor. On an August Sunday, Lillie's mother fell suddenly ill, a fever that rose fast. She had spent months going back and forth, carrying lunch, sitting in the chair like a sentinel, and her body demanded payment, as a dozen houses where work doesn't stop and rest is short. Lillie stayed home, making compresses, boiling water, listening to her mother's breathing shorten, and the boiled water was as much care as an attempt to control what couldn't be controlled. Etta arranged for a black doctor from Greenwood, known for treating people despite limited resources, at a time when access to care was unequal and often depended on networks and trust. The doctor came at dusk, examined her, and the careful way he shook his head prepared the room for the news before it even settled into words. Pneumonia, rest, warmth, attention to nights that cooled even in summer. In the early hours of August 23rd, 1923, Lillie's mother died in bed, already weakened, while night air came through the open window to ease the lack of breath. There was no fall, no startle, only the slow change of breathing until it became silence. Outside, a train sounded in the distance, and the house, patched many times since 1921, answered with its old creaks, as if recognizing one more absence. The death was the second irreversible event, the most intimate, and it changed everything. The cookie tin with nails sat on the table, closed, as if no hand had the strength to look for repairs at that hour. Lillie washed her face, changed the water in the basin, and sat for a while looking at her own hands, as if the lines had become strange. The funeral took place 2 days later in a Tulsa cemetery with a small group. The sun beat down hard. The flowers wilted quickly, and the dry earth demanded effort from those who dug and those who closed the grave. Etta stood in the back, discreet, in a simple hat, because a white woman there would draw attention and could become talk crossing the wrong streets. Even so, she went, without coming too close, without seeking a place that wasn't hers. Afterward, she returned to the shop and closed the door earlier, leaving downtown with its hurry and its display windows. In the days that followed, the partnership was suspended by mourning and by necessity. Lillie returned to work in early September, on a day when downtown seemed emptier because of the holiday. She came in through the back door with hollow eyes, but with the account book on her arm. She sat at the table and opened the cash book like someone returning to a familiar place, not for comfort, but for obligation. Etta set an envelope of money on the table, and a gesture recorded that the rent was covered and the bills had not been abandoned while the Hartford house fell quiet. Autumn brought drier air and cooler nights. The print shop, now more established, had regular customers. Some white customers came for speed and price. Some black customers came through the discreet Greenwood network. The rumor existed like everything in Tulsa, but it never settled into proof. Etta took care that nothing was said out loud in front of anyone. Lillie took care that no compromising paper left the back. It was a life of outlines, and outlines exhaust. Even so, there were moments of normalcy. On a municipal election day, the city had lines and sidewalk talk, and the subject of lighting, cleaning, and paved streets came up as a repeated promise. The shop printed leaflets for a merchants' association about street cleaning and lighting, nothing that named important people, only requests for improvements, short-lived circulation paper that needed to be cheap and legible. Etta delivered and received payment. Lillie, in the back, added and stored. The press kept its regular sound, like a rough clock. The ink smell was the same as May, but now it mixed with the coal smell of the first fireplaces lit, because coal began to enter houses and the backs of shops. The price of discretion showed up in small cuts. In December, an old white customer asked for a steep discount and hinted at trading favors. Etta refused politely and lost the job, and the loss was recorded in the book as an absence of income, not as an insult. In early 1924, the shop received fewer orders from downtown and more from Greenwood, which required more care, more back and forth, more hidden packages, and more time spent en route. Lillie began to feel that for the business to survive, it would have to settle somewhere. It didn't depend on a corridor and a back door. Etta, for her part, felt the weight of being the public face, as if she wore a mask glued on that couldn't be torn off without tearing skin. The final decision didn't come as a speech. It came as routine and cut paper. On February 2nd, 1924, a cold Friday, with frost on the window ledge, Etta arrived early and found Lillie already seated, with a stack of paid bills and a clipped advertisement from the Tulsa World. It was about rooms available for rent in Greenwood on Archer Street. In a rebuilt building, a classified column noticed that treated space as ordinary merchandise. The clipping lay on the table like a concrete possibility. There Lillie's name could exist at the counter without needing shadows, and the main clientele was already in that neighborhood of new brick and old memory. What would be lost in downtown customers could be gained in predictability, and predictability was a form of rest. They sealed the agreement with practical gestures. They chose a gradual transfer without announcement, with accounts closed and equipment moved at alternating hours. In March, they began carrying, little by little, cases of type and reams of paper to Greenwood, using a borrowed car from an acquaintance of Lillie's, and the transport was done like someone moving tools, and also risk, avoiding drawing attention with repeated loads. The larger press stayed on East 2nd until the last moment, but a smaller press was installed first in Greenwood to handle local orders without crossing the city. Etta continued serving some downtown customers, now as an intermediary, avoiding making the new address an immediate target. She kept the sign up for 2 more months as if nothing changed and paid the rent through the end of the lease, because a broken lease becomes debt and debt becomes an unwanted visit. On April 30th, 1924, a Wednesday with strong wind, Etta closed the East 2nd door for the last time. There was no crowd, no public farewell, only the sound of a passing train and a newspaper slapping the sidewalk. Inside, the walls were cleaner, repainted, but there was still a spot where the paint seemed different, as if hiding an old shadow. Etta handed the key to the owner and walked away without looking back more than once, because looking too much was a way of asking the city to remember. The print shop continued in Greenwood, now with another name on the window, simple, hand-painted, Johnson Accounting and Printing. Etta appeared some afternoons, coming in through the front without hurry as a customer or a helper, depending on who was watching. Some white customers never crossed into Greenwood. Others, a few, crossed because they needed the service, and because habit sometimes pushes prejudice into a corner when money demands it. Most orders came from black businesses rebuilding, from churches, barbershops, small markets that wanted labels and receipts like anywhere else. Clarence never returned to making deliveries downtown. His knee healed, but his aunt kept the boy close to home. He began working at a grocery on Greenwood Avenue, carrying sacks and learning to do simple sums, a job of weight and routine that taught discipline early. Sometimes he passed in front of the news shop and slowed to watch the press in motion without going in. Lillie, when she saw him, left a piece of paper with wrong letters on the counter for him to take when no one noticed, a small gesture that didn't fix what had happened, but recorded that the mark hadn't been swept under the rug. In the summer of 1924, Tulsa kept growing, with its new buildings and crowded streets, and Greenwood kept rebuilding, with bricks laid one by one and memory alive in every low conversation. The partnership between Etta and Lillie remained discreet by calculation, like so many things that had to fit inside unwritten rules. Etta kept paying for her room and later rented a small house on West 7th, taking with her the worn blue-covered notebook, pages marked with accounts and rules. Lillie kept the cash book in order and stored the cookie tin of nails on a high shelf, not as a relic, but as a tool, because there was always something to repair in the house and in the business. On a clear, cold Tuesday in November 1924, the Greenwood shop opened before 8, with the window glass still marked with dew. Lillie lit the small stove to heat water and, while she waited, lined up on the table a batch of simple forms for a laundry on Greenwood Avenue. Cream paper, black ink, space for name and date, a format meant to be filled quickly with pencil or fountain pen. Etta arrived a few minutes later, carrying a twine-tied bundle with 2 reams bought downtown, and she knocked her boots on the threshold to shake off dried mud. The neighborhood already had the noise of shop doors rolling up and hurried footsteps, and in the distance a streetcar creaked toward the business district, as if the city were a machine that didn't stop for anyone. That morning there was no unexpected visit, no car parked too long. There was work, and work was the most concrete way to insist. The smaller press made its regular noise, and Lillie fed the sheets one by one, feeling with her fingertips when the paper took too much ink, adjusting pressure to keep the impression clean. Etta stood at the cutter, measuring with her trained eye, lowering the blade firmly so the edges came out clean, and gathering the trimming so the floor wouldn't get slick. During a break, Lillie opened the cash book and added up the previous week's payments, noting beside them the rent, the light bill, the paper installment, and an amount set aside for maintenance, like someone learning not to depend on another person's favor. Etta didn't comment. She only checked the reams, squared a stack, and went back to cutting, keeping her body in the rhythm the room required. Near noon, Clarence passed on the other side of the street with a sack of flour on his shoulder, taller now and heavier than the year before. He didn't stop. He turned his head for a second and saw Etta at the window with her sleeve rolled up, saw Lillie behind the counter with a pencil tucked behind her ear, saw paper moving back and forth as if life could fit into simple things. Then he went on, because he had a schedule, and because in Greenwood he had learned early that survival was also following a route without drawing attention. Late in the afternoon, when the sky began to cool and shadows lengthened over Archer Street, Lillie closed the cash book, wiped the table, and returned the type to the cases, leaving each compartment in place so she wouldn't lose time the next day. Etta turned off the last lamp, checked the lock twice, and set the bolt with the care of someone who had seen what scratched. Before leaving, Lillie rose onto her toes to push the cookie tin a little farther back on the shelf, where it stayed out of sight and within reach if it was ever needed, and Etta straightened the reams for the next morning, leaving the room ready to reopen. Then the two of them closed the door and stepped down to the sidewalk, each taking her usual way, unhurried and not looking too much to either side. and night settled over Greenwood with the same sound of footsteps and streetcars as every night, while inside remained the ink, the paper, and the organized silence of a place that had cost dearly to exist and that, in that moment, simply existed. If you found this story meaningful, please take a moment to like the video. It helps these often forgotten stories find the audience they deserve. Subscribe to Ordinary Lives, Extraordinary Times to stay connected to stories of everyday people who lived through moments that shaped history. Each life mattered. Each story deserves to be remembered. We'd love to hear from you as well. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. This community stretches across places, generations, and personal histories, brought together by a shared respect for the past. Thank you for being here, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive.